The night my father humiliated me in front of 30 relatives, I thought my life was officially over. He stood in the middle of the living room, wearing the same confident smile he always wore when he believed he had complete control, and announced to everyone that I was about to learn a very important lesson about responsibility. My cousins were whispering. My aunts were staring. My brother looked like he was enjoying every second of it. And then my dad said something I will never forget. He told everyone that according to my grandmother's will, I would receive almost nothing from the family estate. I remember the room going silent, 30 people staring at me like I had just failed some kind of test. But what my father didn't know was that 10 minutes later, the family lawyer would walk into that room with documents that would change everything. My name is Victoria. Most people call me Tori. And if you had met my family growing up, you probably would have believed the same thing they did, that I was the disappointment of the family. Not because I did anything terrible, not because I was lazy, but because I wasn't my brother. My father was a retired judge, a man who believed that respect was something you demanded, not something you earned. He had a very clear picture of what success looked like. And unfortunately for me, I didn't fit that picture. My older brother Daniel did. Daniel followed every rule my father believed in. Law school, corporate job, perfect suit, perfect answers. My dad loved introducing him to people. "This is my son, Daniel," he would say proudly. "Future partner at one of the best firms in the state." And then he would glance at me. "And this is my daughter, Tori. Just Tori. No title, no praise, no pride." I learned very early that in my father's world, I existed in second place. Actually, scratch that. Second place would have been an upgrade. Dinner at our house was never normal. Every conversation somehow turned into a comparison. Daniel's internship, Daniel's promotion, Daniel's investment ideas. And then there was me, the girl who decided to study design instead of law. The girl who wanted to build her own creative business instead of working for someone else. The girl who believed that success didn't have to look like a courtroom or a corporate office. To my father, that wasn't ambition. It was rebellion. "You're wasting your potential," he would say almost every week. "You're chasing childish dreams." But the truth is, the one person who never made me feel that way was my grandmother, Grandma Eleanor. She was the only person in the family who actually listened when I spoke. She loved my ideas. She would sit in her sunroom with a cup of tea and ask me about the projects I was working on. Sometimes she would smile and say something that I didn't fully understand at the time. "Tori, the world doesn't reward people who copy others. It rewards the ones brave enough to be themselves." My father hated when she said things like that. He believed she was encouraging my delusions. But Grandma never cared what he thought. She believed in me. And when someone believes in you like that, it changes everything. 3 months before the night my father humiliated me in front of everyone, my grandmother passed away. It happened peacefully. She was 86 years old, sitting in her favorite chair with a book in her hands. When the family gathered for the funeral, the atmosphere was strange. Everyone was sad, of course, but there was also something else in the air. Expectation. Because everyone knew my grandmother had built a very successful life. She owned property, investments, savings. No one talked about it directly, but you could feel the curiosity in every conversation. Who would inherit what? My father seemed especially confident. At one point during the reception, I overheard him talking to one of my uncles. "Mother always trusted my judgment," he said. "I helped her manage most of her legal matters anyway." The way he said it made it sound like the future was already decided. Like everything was going exactly where he wanted it to go. I didn't care about any of that. Honestly, the last thing on my mind was money. I just missed her. The house felt quieter without her laughter. The sunroom felt empty without her teacups and notebooks scattered across the table. She had always been my safe place in a family that felt like a courtroom. And now that safe place was gone. About 6 weeks later, my father announced that we would all be gathering at his house for what he called An important family discussion. 30 relatives showed up. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. It felt more like a formal event than a casual gathering. Daniel was there early, walking around with the same confident smile he always had. My father stood near the fireplace, greeting people like he was hosting some kind of ceremony. I remember feeling uncomfortable the moment I walked in. Something about the energy in the room felt rehearsed, like everyone had been invited for a very specific reason. And then my father tapped a glass with a spoon. The room slowly became quiet. He looked around at everyone with that familiar expression, the one that meant he was about to deliver a speech. "Thank you all for coming," he said calmly. "As many of you know, my mother left behind an estate that required careful legal review." He paused dramatically. "And tonight, I think it's time we clarify a few things." My stomach tightened. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt like I was standing in the middle of a trial, and somehow, I was the defendant. For a moment after my father finished his sentence, the room stayed completely silent. 30 relatives sat around the living room, waiting for whatever dramatic announcement he had planned. I could already feel the tension in my chest. My father loved moments like this. Moments where everyone's attention was on him. Moments where he controlled the narrative. He slowly folded his hands behind his back and looked directly at me. That look. I knew it too well. It was the same look he used whenever he wanted to prove a point. "Tori," he said calmly. My stomach tightened. "Yes," I replied. "Why don't you come stand next to me for a moment?" A few people in the room exchanged curious glances. I could already hear my cousin whisper something under her breath. Reluctantly, I stood up from the couch and walked toward the fireplace where my father was standing. 30 pairs of eyes followed me across the room. I suddenly felt like I was 10 years old again, like I was about to be scolded in front of the entire class. When I reached him, he placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. It wasn't a warm gesture. It felt more like someone positioning a prop on stage. "My daughter Tori," he began, looking around the room. "As many of you know, she has always chosen a different path in life." I could already feel the embarrassment rising in my chest. My brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment. My father continued. "While Daniel chose a stable and respectable career in law, he paused. Tori decided to pursue creative ventures." A couple of relatives chuckled quietly. Creative ventures. That was his polite way of saying he believed my career was a joke. I tried to keep my expression calm, but inside I could feel my patience slipping. My father slowly walked toward the center of the room. "The reason I invited everyone here tonight," he said, "is because there have been some questions about my mother's estate." Several relatives leaned forward. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. My father picked up a folder from the table. "I've spent the last several weeks reviewing the details of her will," he continued. "And as the person who handled most of her legal affairs, I believe it's important that the family understands how things will be distributed." He glanced at Daniel, then at me, and I already knew where this was going. "Daniel," he said proudly, "has always demonstrated responsibility, discipline, and sound judgment." Daniel smiled slightly. A few relatives nodded approvingly. "And because of those qualities," my father continued, "he will be receiving a significant portion of the estate." More nodding. More approving looks. No surprise there. Daniel had always been the golden child. Then my father turned to me again. "But life also teaches us lessons," he said slowly. The room felt colder somehow. "Sometimes those lessons come in the form of consequences." My heart started pounding. He opened the folder and pulled out a document. After reviewing my mother's wishes carefully, he announced, "It appears that Tori will be receiving a very small portion of the estate." I heard someone gasp quietly. Another relative shifted uncomfortably in their seat. And then my father delivered the sentence that made my face burn with humiliation. "I believe my mother wanted this to serve as a reminder," he said. That stability and responsibility matter. The room was silent again. But this silence felt different. It felt heavy, judgmental. I could feel everyone looking at me. Some with pity, some with curiosity, some with quiet agreement. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Well," he said casually, "I guess that's what happens when you choose passion projects over real careers." A few cousins laughed quietly. I wanted to disappear, but somehow I forced myself to stay still. My father wasn't finished. "And because I believe in accountability," he continued, "I've decided that Tori should take some time to reflect on her choices." He paused. Then he said something that made my entire body freeze. "Until she demonstrates financial responsibility, I'll be temporarily managing what little inheritance she does receive." For a moment, I couldn't process what he had just said. Managing? Meaning controlling it. Meaning deciding how I could use it. It was the same thing he used to do when I was 16 and asked for spending money. Except now he was doing it in front of 30 people. I felt my hands trembling slightly, and then something strange happened. I heard a quiet voice near the doorway. "Excuse me." Everyone in the room turned. Standing in the entrance was a tall man in a dark suit. A leather briefcase rested in his hand. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Collins, my grandmother's lawyer. He looked slightly confused by the scene in front of him. "I apologize for the interruption," he said politely, "but I believe I may be arriving at exactly the right moment." My father frowned. "Mr. Collins," he said slowly, "I wasn't aware you were attending tonight." Mr. Collins stepped inside. "Yes," he replied calmly. "Your mother specifically requested that I be present when certain family discussions took place." The room went completely quiet. My father's expression tightened. "I've already reviewed my mother's will," he said confidently. "There's really no need." Mr. Collins gently raised a hand. "With respect," he said, "what you reviewed may not be the complete picture." A few relatives leaned forward again. The tension in the room suddenly shifted. Mr. Collins placed his briefcase on the table and slowly opened it. Inside were several official-looking documents. He pulled one out carefully. Then he looked directly at me. "Tori," he said kindly, "I believe your grandmother asked me to deliver this information personally." My father crossed his arms. "What information?" he demanded. Mr. Collins turned to face the entire room. "The information regarding the irrevocable trust your mother created several years ago." My father blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Mr. Collins adjusted his glasses. "Yes," he said calmly, "an irrevocable trust. And according to these documents," he paused, "and your grandmother's very clear instructions." The entire room held its breath. Victoria is the sole beneficiary. For a moment after Mr. Collins said those words, the room went completely silent. Not the polite kind of silence. The kind where everyone is waiting for someone to say just kidding. But no one did. My father blinked slowly, as if he had misheard something. "I'm sorry," he said, forcing a tight smile. "Did you say sole beneficiary?" Mr. Collins nodded calmly. "Yes, that is exactly what I said." You could feel the tension spread across the room like electricity. My cousin stopped whispering. My aunt lowered the glass she had been holding. Even Daniel straightened in his chair. My father let out a small laugh. But it wasn't a confident laugh. It was the kind people make when they are trying to convince themselves that something ridiculous just happened. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I've reviewed my mother's will personally." Mr. Collins looked at him carefully. "Yes," he replied. "I'm sure you reviewed the will." My father's smile faded. "But this," Mr. Collins continued, gently tapping the document in his hand, "is not the will." A murmur spread through the room. "This is the trust agreement your mother established 5 years ago." My heart skipped. 5 years ago? That was around the time my grandmother had started asking me more questions about my business ideas, about my plans. about what I wanted to build. Mr. Collins placed the document on the table so everyone could see the official stamps. Your mother created an irrevocable trust, he explained, which means once it was signed, it could not be changed or overridden. My father stepped forward. Why wasn't I informed about this? He demanded. Mr. Collins remained calm. Because your mother specifically requested that this arrangement remain private until the appropriate time. My father's jaw tightened. That makes no sense. I handled most of her legal matters. Yes, Mr. Collins said quietly. But not this one. A few relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I could feel everyone's attention slowly moving toward me, but I was just as confused as they were. I don't understand, I said softly. Mr. Collins turned toward me. Your grandmother believed in you very deeply, Tori. My throat tightened. She told me many times that you were the only person in the family who spoke to her about ideas instead of money. I remembered all those afternoons in her sunroom, talking about creativity, talking about building something meaningful. I never imagined those conversations meant anything more than encouragement. Mr. Collins continued. She believed that one day you would build something extraordinary. My father scoffed. This is ridiculous, he said. You're telling me my mother gave everything to someone who runs a small design business? Mr. Collins met his gaze calmly. I'm telling you that your mother made her decision very carefully. Daniel stood up from his chair. How much are we talking about? He asked bluntly. The room grew quiet again. Mr. Collins opened another document. The trust includes several investment accounts, 2 properties, and a diversified portfolio that has grown significantly over the past 5 years. He paused. Then he said something that made the entire room freeze. The current value of the trust is approximately $8 million. Someone dropped a glass. My aunt gasped. Daniel stared at the papers like they had personally insulted him. My father's face turned pale. That's impossible, he said slowly. It's not, Mr. Collins replied. And according to the trust agreement, Tori is the only person with legal authority over those assets. I felt like the floor beneath me had disappeared. $8 million? This couldn't be real. I looked around the room. Just minutes ago, these same people had been watching me get humiliated. Now they were staring at me like I had suddenly become someone else. Daniel shook his head. There has to be some kind of condition, he said. There is, Mr. Collins replied. Everyone leaned forward. The condition, he continued, is that no one else in the family has control over the trust. My father's voice became sharp. That's absurd. Mr. Collins didn't react. In fact, he said calmly, the trust includes a clause specifically preventing outside influence. What does that mean? Someone asked. It means, Mr. Collins explained, that no family member, including you, Judge Harrison, can manage, access, or interfere with the trust in any way. The room felt like it was spinning. Just 10 minutes ago, my father had been announcing that he would control what little inheritance I received. Now the situation had completely reversed. My father tried to regain his composure. This is highly irregular, he said. No, Mr. Collins replied. It's actually quite common when someone wants to ensure their wishes are respected. My father's voice lowered. She must have been manipulated. Mr. Collins closed the folder slowly. Your mother was very clear about her reasoning. He reached into his briefcase again and removed a small envelope. There is also a letter. My heart skipped again. A letter. I whispered. Mr. Collins nodded. Yes. It's addressed to you. He walked over and handed it to me. My hands were shaking slightly as I held the envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandmother's neat cursive letters across the front. To my dear Tori. The room was silent again. 30 relatives watching me. Waiting. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I took a deep breath and began to read. My hands were trembling slightly as I unfolded the letter. For a moment, I just stared at the familiar handwriting. It felt like hearing her voice again after months of silence. The room around me was completely still. 30 relatives waiting. My father standing a few feet away, arms crossed. Daniel watching me carefully. And Mr. Collins standing quietly near the table. I took a deep breath and began reading. My dearest Tori, if you are reading this letter, it means the time has finally come for the truth to be revealed. My throat tightened instantly. I paused for a second before continuing. First, I want you to know something very important. You were never the disappointment in this family. Not for a single day. A wave of emotion rushed through me. Across the room, a few relatives shifted uncomfortably. I continued reading. For many years, I watched how people treated you. I watched how your ideas were dismissed, how your dreams were questioned, and how you were constantly compared to others. But what most people failed to understand was that you possessed something far more valuable than approval. You possessed courage. My eyes started to blur slightly. You had the courage to build your own path instead of following someone else's. And that is something very few people in this family have ever done. The room felt even quieter now. Even Daniel had stopped moving. I kept reading. 5 years ago, I made a decision. I created a trust that would give you complete control over the future I believe you deserve. Not because you needed money, but because you needed freedom. My heart felt like it was pounding in my chest. Freedom to build the life you imagine. Freedom to prove that success does not have only one shape. And most importantly, freedom from people who mistake control for love. For the first time since this entire night started, I glanced up. My father's expression had completely changed. His confident posture was gone. I looked back down at the letter. Tori, if there is one lesson I hope you remember, it is this. The people who laugh at your dreams today may one day stand in line to benefit from them. When that moment comes, I trust you will make decisions with wisdom and kindness. But never forget your worth. Never forget the strength it took for you to remain yourself in a world determined to change you. My voice grew quieter as I read the final line. I have always been proud of you. With all my love. Grandma Eleanor. For several seconds after I finished reading, no one said anything. The silence felt heavier than before. Not uncomfortable, just different. Like the entire room had suddenly realized something important. I slowly folded the letter and held it against my chest. My father cleared his throat. Well, he said, trying to regain his composure. This is unexpected. That might have been the understatement of the year. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. So you're telling me, he said slowly, looking at Mr. Collins, that Tori now controls everything? Mr. Collins nodded calmly. Yes. And legally speaking, he added, the trust cannot be altered or redistributed. Daniel stared at the floor. My father stepped forward again. Tori, he said. For the first time that night, his voice sounded almost careful. We should probably discuss how the family can move forward from here. I looked at him. Just an hour ago, he had been standing in the same spot announcing that I deserved almost nothing. Now the tone had completely changed. My aunt suddenly spoke up. Well, family is family, she said quickly. And I'm sure Tori understands that we all supported your grandmother for many years. Another uncle nodded. Yes, exactly. It would only be fair for everyone to benefit somehow. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the shift was so obvious. Just 30 minutes ago, I had been the girl who made poor life choices. Now I was apparently the center of everyone's financial hopes. Daniel stepped closer. Look, he said, trying to sound reasonable. No one is saying you have to handle everything alone. You could let Dad help manage the assets. There it was again. Control. The same control my grandmother had warned me about. I looked around the room slowly. 30 relatives. Different expressions. Some embarrassed. Some hopeful. Some calculating. And then I realized something important. For the first time in my life, I was the one holding the power in this room. I took a deep breath. "Thank you," I said calmly. Everyone seemed to lean forward slightly, but Grandma trusted me to make my own decisions. My father's jaw tightened again. "And that's exactly what I'm going to do." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" I smiled slightly. "It means the trust will remain exactly as it was designed." Mr. Collins nodded approvingly. My father sighed. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose we'll talk about this again later. Maybe we would. Maybe we wouldn't." But something had already changed. For years, my family believed success only looked one way. A law degree, a courtroom, a corporate office. But that night proved something else entirely. Sometimes success looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like resilience. And sometimes it looks like quietly proving everyone wrong. I slipped my grandmother's letter back into the envelope, and as I walked toward the door, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval anymore. If you made it this far into my story, thank you for listening. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who doubt us the most. But that doesn't mean their opinion defines our future. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more real-life style stories like this. And I'm curious about something. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone underestimated you and later realized they were wrong? Or do you have someone in your family who always doubts your dreams? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one,